Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 of the most disturbing, true psychopath horror stories that have ever been documented. These are not exaggerated tales or fictional nightmares, but verified accounts of real individuals who encountered people completely devoid of empathy, remorse, or basic human conscience. What makes these stories particularly chilling is not the violence or supernatural elements, but the cold, calculated nature of the predators involved. Each account has been thoroughly investigated and corroborated through police reports, witness statements, and psychological evaluations. These stories reveal the terrifying reality that monsters do exist, and they walk among us wearing masks of normalcy. From manipulative stalkers to sadistic experimenters. Tonight, you will hear about 7 encounters that expose the darkest capabilities of the human mind. If you appreciate authentic, true horror content that explores the genuine darkness that exists in our world, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into documented cases of human evil. After you experience these harrowing accounts tonight, we encourage you to share your thoughts and any similar experiences in the comments section below. Now prepare yourself as we examine 7 terrifying encounters with individuals who society would label as true psychopaths. Samuel lived in a quiet suburban apartment complex on the east side of town. The kind of place where people kept to themselves but exchanged polite nods in the hallway. He had moved there 3 years prior after accepting a position as a freelance graphic designer, a job that allowed him to work from the comfort of his 1-bedroom apartment. The complex was older but well maintained, with thick walls that provided privacy and a small balcony that overlooked a courtyard filled with oak trees. Samuel appreciated the solitude his lifestyle afforded him. His days followed a comfortable routine that began with coffee on the balcony each morning, followed by hours at his computer creating logos and website designs for various clients. In the evenings, he would take a walk around the complex to stretch his legs, sometimes venturing to the nearby park before returning home to prepare dinner and spend the rest of the night reading or watching documentaries. Samuel had minimal interaction with his neighbors, which suited him perfectly. He recognized faces in passing and exchanged occasional small talk with the elderly woman who lived across the hall. But he valued his privacy and assumed others felt the same way. The man who lived in the apartment directly above him was someone Samuel had barely spoken to in all the time he had lived there. His name was Richard, or at least that was the name on the mailbox. Samuel had encountered him perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, usually in the parking lot or laundry room. Richard appeared to be in his late 50s, average height with thinning gray hair, and he always wore outdated clothing that seemed too large for his frame. Their interactions had never extended beyond a brief hello or comment about the weather. Richard seemed harmless enough, just another quiet resident in a building full of people who preferred to keep to themselves. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday afternoon in early September. Samuel returned from a quick trip to the grocery store and noticed that his apartment felt different somehow. He could not pinpoint exactly what had changed, but there was a subtle wrongness to the space that made his skin prickle with unease. He walked through each room carefully, checking the windows and inspecting his belongings, but everything appeared to be in its proper place. He attributed the feeling to paranoia or perhaps fatigue from working long hours on a demanding project. Over the next few weeks, however, the feeling persisted and grew stronger. Small items seemed to be in slightly different positions than where he remembered leaving them. A coffee mug that he was certain he had placed in the sink would be sitting on the counter. Books on his shelf appeared to have been moved and returned incorrectly. His computer mouse would be on the opposite side of his keyboard than where he always kept it. Samuel began to question his own memory and wondered if the isolation of working from home was affecting his mental state. He considered that perhaps he was simply becoming more forgetful or distracted by his workload. Then he noticed something that could not be explained away by forgetfulness. His mail, which was delivered to a locked mailbox in the lobby, appeared to have been tampered with. Envelopes that should have been sealed were slightly open, and the contents seemed to have been examined and carelessly returned. He reported this to the building management, who assured him they would look into the matter but seemed skeptical that anything unusual was occurring. They suggested that perhaps the postal service was mishandling the mail, or that the envelopes had simply not been properly sealed to begin with. The incidents escalated one evening in October, when Samuel was working late at his computer. He was focused on completing a logo design when he noticed a small green light activate on his laptop's built-in webcam. He had not initiated any video calls or opened any applications that would require camera access. The light remained on for several seconds before switching off. Samuel immediately checked his running applications and security settings, but found nothing that explained the activation. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as he realized that someone might have remote access to his computer and had been watching him through his own webcam. He immediately covered the camera with black tape and began running security scans on his system, though the scans revealed no obvious malware or unauthorized access. That night, Samuel could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying all the small, strange incidents that had occurred over the past 2 months. The displaced items, the tampered mail, the webcam activation. Individually, each incident could be dismissed or rationalized. But together, they formed a disturbing pattern that suggested someone was invading his privacy in ways he had not yet fully discovered. The next morning, he made a decision that would ultimately save him from a far worse fate. He ordered a simple doorbell camera from an online retailer, one that would record anyone who approached his apartment door and send alerts to his phone. The camera arrived 2 days later, and Samuel installed it immediately, positioning it to capture a clear view of his doorway and the hallway beyond. For the first 3 days, the camera recorded nothing unusual. Samuel saw himself coming and going, the elderly neighbor across the hall checking her mail, and a delivery person dropping off a package. Then on the 4th day, while Samuel was out running errands, his phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera. He opened the application, expecting to see a delivery person or perhaps someone who had knocked on the wrong door. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. Richard, his upstairs neighbor, was standing in front of Samuel's door. He was holding something in his hand that Samuel could not quite make out in the video. Richard glanced up and down the hallway, then inserted what was clearly a key into Samuel's lock. The door opened and Richard stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Samuel sat in his parked car outside the grocery store, hands shaking as he watched the recorded footage again and again. His upstairs neighbor had a key to his apartment. Richard had entered his home without permission while Samuel was away. The realization hit him like a physical blow. All those times he had felt that something was wrong. All those displaced items and strange feelings of being watched had not been paranoia or imagination. Someone had been entering his apartment regularly, and now Samuel had proof. He immediately called the police from the parking lot, explaining the situation and sending them the video footage from his phone. The dispatcher took his information and assured him that officers would meet him at his apartment complex within the hour. Samuel waited in his car until he saw the police cruiser pull into the parking lot. 2 officers approached his vehicle, and he showed them the video footage on his phone. Their expressions grew serious as they watched Richard enter the apartment with the unauthorized key. Samuel provided them with Richard's apartment number and explained the history of strange incidents that had been occurring. The officers asked Samuel to wait outside while they investigated. They went to Richard's apartment first and knocked on the door. Samuel watched from a distance as Richard answered, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as the officers spoke with him. After several minutes of conversation at the doorway, the officers escorted Richard down to Samuel's apartment and asked him to open the door with the key he possessed. Richard complied, producing a key from his pocket that unlocked Samuel's door without any difficulty. When questioned about how he obtained the key and why he had entered the apartment without permission, Richard became defensive. He claimed that he had found the key in the hallway months ago and had been checking on the apartment periodically to make sure everything was secure. His explanation made no sense and contradicted itself multiple times. The officers were not satisfied with his answers and asked if they could search Richard's apartment. Richard refused initially, but eventually agreed when the officers explained that they could obtain a warrant based on the video evidence of illegal entry. What the officers discovered in Richard's apartment was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. They found a notebook filled with detailed entries about Samuel's daily activities, written in cramped handwriting that covered hundreds of pages. The entries included times when Samuel left and returned to his apartment, what he was wearing, what groceries he purchased, and even observations about his mood and behavior. There were sketches throughout the notebook, crude drawings of Samuel sitting at his computer, sleeping in his bed, and standing on his balcony. Richard had been surveilling Samuel with an obsessive level of detail for what appeared to be at least a year, possibly longer. The officers also discovered a collection of items that clearly belonged to Samuel. There was a coffee mug that Samuel had thought he misplaced months earlier, a t-shirt that had disappeared from his laundry, a paperback book he had been reading that had vanished from his nightstand. Most disturbingly, they found a shoebox containing locks of hair in various shades of brown, photographs of Samuel that had been taken without his knowledge or consent, and printouts of personal documents that could only have been obtained by accessing Samuel's computer or mail. The photographs showed Samuel in various states of undress, clearly taken through his apartment window or possibly from inside his apartment while he slept. Richard was arrested on the spot for illegal entry, stalking, and possession of stolen property. As the officers placed handcuffs on him, Richard remained eerily calm. He did not seem to understand that his behavior was criminal or deeply violating. He kept insisting that he was simply getting to know Samuel and that they were going to be close friends eventually. He spoke about Samuel as if they had an intimate relationship, referencing private moments and personal details that he should not have known. The officers had to physically guide him to the patrol car as he continued talking about how Samuel would eventually understand and appreciate the connection they shared. Samuel stood in the hallway watching Richard being taken away, feeling violated and sickened by the scope of the invasion he had endured. The police informed him that they would need to conduct a thorough investigation of his apartment to document evidence and check for any additional surveillance equipment that Richard might have installed. Over the next several hours, investigators swept Samuel's apartment and discovered 2 hidden cameras. One had been placed inside a smoke detector in his bedroom, and another was concealed in a small decorative item on his bookshelf in the living room. Both cameras were wireless and had been transmitting footage to a receiver in Richard's apartment above. Samuel realized with horror that Richard had been watching him in real time for months, possibly years, observing his most private moments. The investigation expanded as detectives dug deeper into Richard's background. They discovered that he had a history of similar behavior in 2 previous cities where he had lived. In both cases, he had developed obsessive fixations on neighbors and had been caught engaging in stalking behavior. However, in those instances, the charges had been reduced or dismissed due to lack of concrete evidence or plea agreements. Richard had moved from place to place, each time finding a new target for his obsessive attention. The psychological evaluation conducted after his arrest revealed that Richard exhibited severe personality disorders, including obsessive fixation, lack of boundaries, and an inability to comprehend that his actions were harmful or unwanted. He genuinely believed that his surveillance and collection of personal items was a form of relationship building. During interrogation, Richard confessed to entering Samuel's apartment at least 3 times per week over the course of 18 months. He would time his entries for when he knew Samuel was away, using the knowledge gained from his constant surveillance. Once inside, Richard would sit in Samuel's living room for hours, touching his belongings, reading his personal journals, and examining his photographs. He described feeling a sense of intimacy and connection during these intrusions, as if he were becoming part of Samuel's life. Most disturbingly, Richard admitted to occasionally drugging Samuel's coffee maker with mild sedatives so that he could enter the apartment while Samuel was home but heavily asleep. He had sat in a chair watching Samuel sleep on multiple occasions, sometimes for several hours at a time. The full extent of Richard's obsession was documented in the notebooks and digital files seized from his apartment. He had created detailed plans for the future that involved him and Samuel living together, traveling together, and sharing their lives in ways that existed only in Richard's disturbed mind. He had never once considered that Samuel might not want this connection, or that his behavior was criminal and deeply disturbing. Richard's complete inability to recognize boundaries or understand consent made him particularly dangerous. The prosecution argued that he would have eventually escalated to more direct and violent actions if he had not been caught. Samuel moved out of the apartment complex within 2 weeks of Richard's arrest. He could not bear to stay in a place where he had been watched and violated for so long without his knowledge. The psychological impact of the discovery was profound. He found himself constantly checking for cameras, changing locks repeatedly, and struggling with intense anxiety about his privacy and safety. He learned during the trial that Richard had kept extensive digital files containing thousands of photographs and hours of video footage documenting Samuel's daily life in intimate detail. The violation felt absolute and irreversible. Richard was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by mandatory psychiatric treatment and a permanent restraining order. The sentence felt inadequate to Samuel given the extent and duration of the stalking and invasion of privacy he had endured. He attended every court hearing, wanting to face the man who had stolen his sense of security and privacy. Throughout the proceedings, Richard maintained that he had done nothing wrong and that Samuel had overreacted to what he still described as friendly interest. His complete lack of remorse or understanding made the experience even more traumatic. Samuel still lives with the aftermath of what Richard did to him. He has difficulty forming connections with neighbors and constantly monitors his surroundings for signs of surveillance. Every apartment he considers requires extensive security measures before he feels comfortable moving in. He researches his neighbors obsessively and maintains detailed records of everyone who lives near him, a behavior he recognizes as unhealthy but cannot stop. The therapy he attends helps him process the trauma, but some wounds do not fully heal. He knows that Richard will be released eventually, and despite the restraining order, Samuel fears that the obsession may not have ended. Some nights, he still wakes up thinking about those months when Richard sat in the darkness watching him sleep. And the knowledge that he was completely unaware during that time haunts him in ways that are difficult to articulate. The violation was not just physical, but psychological. A theft of the basic human right to privacy and safety in one's own home. Aria was a single mother who worked double shifts as a registered nurse at the county hospital. Her days began before sunrise and often did not end until well past dinner time. The demands of her profession were exhausting, but the pay was necessary to support herself and her 6-year-old daughter, Emma. Aria's ex-husband had left when Emma was 2 years old and provided minimal financial support. So the burden of childcare and household expenses fell entirely on her shoulders. She had cobbled together a patchwork of babysitting arrangements over the years, relying on neighbors and daycare services that were affordable, but often unreliable. When her primary babysitter moved out of state the previous spring, Aria found herself desperately searching for someone trustworthy who could care for Emma during her long and irregular work hours. The solution appeared to come through a recommendation from a co-worker who knew someone named Rebecca. Rebecca was in her early 30s, had glowing references from multiple families, and had completed coursework in early childhood education. She presented herself as professional and nurturing during the initial interview at Aria's home. Rebecca asked thoughtful questions about Emma's routine, dietary restrictions, and favorite activities. She spoke knowledgeably about child development and seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the position. Emma, who was typically shy around strangers, warmed to Rebecca almost immediately. They played together with building blocks, while Aria and Rebecca discussed scheduling and compensation. By the end of the interview, Aria felt relieved and grateful to have found someone so qualified and personable. Rebecca's references checked out perfectly, with previous employers describing her as punctual, responsible, and excellent with children. Rebecca began working for Aria in early June, caring for Emma 5 days per week, while Aria worked her shifts at the hospital. The arrangement seemed ideal during the first few months. Rebecca always arrived on time and kept the house tidy. Emma would excitedly tell Aria about the activities they did together, including arts and crafts projects, trips to the park, and educational games. Rebecca provided detailed updates about Emma's day, including what she ate, when she napped, and any notable behaviors or accomplishments. Aria felt fortunate to have found such an attentive and capable caregiver. For the first time in years, she felt confident leaving Emma in someone else's care without constant worry about her daughter's safety and well-being. The first indication that something was wrong came in late August, approximately 3 months after Rebecca started. Emma began having nightmares that woke her several times per night. She would cry out in her sleep and wake up disoriented and frightened. When Aria asked what the nightmares were about, Emma gave vague answers about dark places and being alone. Aria attributed this to normal childhood fears and tried to comfort her daughter with nightlights and reassurance. However, the nightmares persisted and intensified. Emma also became increasingly withdrawn and quiet, a dramatic change from her normally cheerful and talkative personality. She stopped wanting to play with her toys and seemed anxious whenever Aria prepared to leave for work. When Aria asked if everything was okay with Rebecca, Emma would nod silently but would not meet her mother's eyes. The concerning behaviors escalated when Emma's teacher called Aria at work to discuss troubling drawings that Emma had created during art time at school. The drawings depicted a small figure trapped inside what appeared to be a closet or small dark space, with a larger figure standing outside. The teacher explained that Emma had drawn similar pictures multiple times and had become upset when asked to explain them. Aria left work early that day and sat down with Emma to gently ask about the drawings. Emma remained silent for a long time before whispering that Rebecca played games that scared her. When pressed for details, Emma became visibly distressed and said that Rebecca told her she was not allowed to tell anyone about their secret games or something bad would happen to Aria. The revelation sent ice through Aria's veins. She reassured Emma that no one would hurt Aria and that Emma would never be in trouble for telling the truth. Slowly and haltingly, Emma began to describe what had been happening during the days when she was alone with Rebecca. The babysitter would lock Emma in the hallway closet as punishment for minor mistakes like spilling juice or not cleaning up toys quickly enough. Emma would be left in the darkness for what felt like hours, sometimes missing meals, Rebecca would tell elaborate stories through the closet door about monsters that hurt little girls who told secrets to their mothers. She coached Emma on what to say if Arya asked questions, making her practice responses until Rebecca was satisfied that Emma would not reveal the truth. Arya felt sick as she listened to her daughter describe the systematic psychological abuse she had endured for months. She immediately called the police and filed a report. But she knew that without physical evidence, the case would be difficult to prove. Emma had no visible injuries, and it would come down to the word of a 6-year-old child against an adult with excellent references. Arya made the decision to install hidden cameras throughout her home before confronting Rebecca or terminating her employment. She wanted concrete evidence of what was being done to her daughter. The cameras were small and easily concealed, positioned in the living room, kitchen, and hallway, where the closet was located. The footage that the cameras captured over the next 3 days was more disturbing than Arya could have imagined. Rebecca's behavior when she believed she was unobserved was completely different from the warm and nurturing persona she displayed in Arya's presence. The very first day of recording showed Rebecca speaking to Emma in a cold, detached tone that lacked any warmth or emotion. When Emma accidentally knocked over a cup of water, Rebecca's expression did not change as she grabbed the child's arm and dragged her to the hallway closet. She pushed Emma inside and locked the door, then returned to the kitchen to prepare her own lunch as if nothing had happened. Emma's muffled crying could be heard on the audio, but Rebecca showed no reaction whatsoever. She ate her lunch slowly, checked her phone, and did not return to let Emma out for over 2 hours. The footage from the second day showed Rebecca conducting what she described as lessons. She made Emma sit perfectly still at the kitchen table, while Rebecca asked questions about what Emma would say if her mother asked about their day. If Emma's answer was not exactly what Rebecca wanted to hear, she would make the child repeat it again and again until the response was perfect. Rebecca's voice remained flat and emotionless throughout these sessions, treating Emma like a subject in an experiment rather than a child in her care. She showed no anger or frustration, just a methodical determination to control every aspect of Emma's behavior and responses. The most chilling footage came from the third day. Rebecca sat Emma down and explained in precise detail what would happen if Emma ever told her mother about the closet or the lessons. She described scenarios where Arya would get hurt at work, where Emma would be taken away to live with strangers, where terrible things would happen because Emma could not keep their secrets. Her tone remained calm and matter-of-fact, as if she were explaining simple cause and effect rather than terrorizing a child with psychological manipulation. Emma sat frozen in fear, tears streaming down her face, while Rebecca continued speaking in that same emotionless voice. When Emma began to cry harder, Rebecca did not comfort her or show any concern. She simply told the child to stop crying because it was annoying and served no purpose. Arya watched the footage with her hands shaking and tears of rage and horror streaming down her face. This woman had been systematically abusing her daughter for months, and Arya had been completely unaware. She immediately copied all the footage to multiple devices and contacted both the police and an attorney. With concrete video evidence, the case against Rebecca was now undeniable. Arya also reached out to the families who had provided references for Rebecca, sharing what she had discovered and asking if their children had experienced anything similar. The confrontation with Rebecca took place with police present at Arya's home. When shown the video evidence, Rebecca's response was what law enforcement would later describe as one of the most disturbing reactions they had witnessed. She showed no shame, remorse, or even concern about being caught. Instead, she seemed genuinely confused about why Arya was upset. Rebecca explained in that same flat, emotionless tone that she had been conditioning Emma to be more obedient and disciplined. She described her methods as effective behavioral modification techniques that would benefit Emma in the long run. She spoke about Emma as if the child were a problematic project that required correction rather than a person with feelings and rights. When Arya screamed at Rebecca that she had been torturing a 6-year-old child, Rebecca's expression remained unchanged. She calmly stated that Arya was overreacting and did not understand proper child-rearing methods. She showed no capacity to recognize that locking a child in a dark closet for hours, psychologically terrorizing her with threats, and manipulating her through fear constituted abuse. Rebecca genuinely believed her actions were appropriate and beneficial. When the officers informed her that she was being arrested, Rebecca became irritated rather than frightened. She complained that people were too sensitive about discipline and that parents like Arya were raising children who would grow up to be undisciplined and problematic. The police investigation that followed revealed a pattern of behavior spanning nearly a decade. Rebecca had worked for 7 different families over that time period, and when investigators contacted them, several reported that their children had undergone behavioral changes during and after Rebecca's employment. The children had become withdrawn, fearful, and exhibited signs of trauma that the parents had attributed to other causes, such as starting school or developmental phases. None of the families had suspected their babysitter because Rebecca had been so convincing in her professional persona. The children had been too frightened to tell their parents the truth, and without evidence, the abuse had remained hidden. Investigators discovered journals in Rebecca's apartment that documented her work with different families over the years. The entries were written in clinical language, describing children as subjects and referring to her abuse techniques as experiments in behavioral conditioning. She recorded detailed observations about which methods were most effective in achieving compliance and silence. There was no emotion in the writing, no acknowledgement that she was dealing with real children who were suffering. Rebecca had treated each child care position as an opportunity to test her theories about control and manipulation. She viewed children as objects to be molded, rather than as vulnerable human beings deserving of care and protection. The trial was lengthy and emotionally devastating for Arya and Emma. Rebecca showed no remorse throughout the proceedings and maintained that her actions had been misunderstood and mischaracterized. She insisted that she had never harmed any child, and that discipline and structure were being criminalized by an overly permissive society. Her complete lack of empathy or understanding made it clear to everyone in the courtroom that she was incapable of recognizing the trauma she had inflicted. The prosecution presented testimony from multiple families whose children had been under Rebecca's care, and the patterns of psychological abuse were undeniable and consistent across all cases. Rebecca was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of child abuse and endangerment and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Even as the sentence was read, she maintained the same emotionless demeanor that had characterized all her interactions. She filed appeals claiming that her constitutional rights had been violated and that the evidence against her had been obtained improperly. She never once expressed concern for the children she had harmed or acknowledged that her actions had been wrong. Mental health professionals who evaluated her diagnosed her with severe antisocial personality disorder and assessed that she posed a continued danger to children and would likely re-offend if given the opportunity. Emma required years of intensive therapy to recover from the psychological damage that Rebecca had inflicted. She struggled with anxiety, nightmares, and difficulty trusting adults. Arya carried overwhelming guilt for not recognizing the signs earlier and for leaving her daughter in the care of someone so dangerous. She joined advocacy groups pushing for more stringent background check requirements and better screening processes for childcare providers. She learned through her advocacy work that predators like Rebecca specifically sought positions of trust and access to vulnerable children, and that they were often skilled at maintaining convincing facades while committing abuse behind closed doors. The case raised troubling questions about how Rebecca had managed to abuse children across multiple families over nearly 10 years without being caught or stopped. The answer lay partly in her ability to manipulate both children and adults, but also in the isolation of individual families who had no way of knowing about her history. The children she abused were too young and too frightened to effectively communicate what was happening, and the psychological nature of her abuse left no physical evidence. It was only the hidden cameras in Aria's home that finally provided undeniable proof of what Rebecca was doing. Aria still thinks about the other children who were harmed by Rebecca in the years before Emma. Children whose parents never learned the truth about what their babysitter had done. She wonders how many others suffered in silence and carried trauma into their adult lives without ever understanding its source. The knowledge that someone so devoid of empathy and conscience had been welcomed into her home and given unrestricted access to her most precious person haunts Aria in ways that are difficult to express. Trust, once shattered so completely, is almost impossible to rebuild. David had been volunteering at Memorial County Hospital for nearly 2 years when staff members first began to notice the pattern. He was a familiar presence on the geriatric wing, a tall man in his mid-40s who always dressed in neat, casual clothing and wore a volunteer badge clipped to his shirt pocket. David worked a regular job during the weekdays as an insurance adjuster. But he dedicated his weekends to the hospital, arriving Saturday and Sunday mornings to spend time with elderly patients who had few or no visitors. The nursing staff appreciated his consistent presence and his apparent dedication to bringing comfort to people in their final days or weeks of life. He would read to patients, help them with meals, and simply sit with them to provide companionship in what was often a lonely and frightening time. The hospital administration had been thrilled to have such a reliable volunteer. David had passed all background checks and had provided references from community organizations where he claimed to have volunteered previously. His application had been exemplary, and during his interview, he spoke eloquently about his desire to give back to the community and provide comfort to those who were suffering. He explained that he had lost his own grandmother to a long illness and had seen how much difference a caring presence could make during those difficult final days. The volunteer coordinator had been moved by his story and had immediately approved his application. David established a routine that took him from room to room on the geriatric wing. He would check with the nursing station to learn which patients had not received visitors that week, and he would prioritize spending time with the most isolated individuals. He carried a worn leather bag that contained books, magazines, and occasionally small gifts like flowers or puzzle books. Patients who were lucid enough to communicate often expressed gratitude for his visits, and several had specifically requested that David be notified when he was not on shift so that he could come read to them or simply sit with them. However, a night shift nurse named Patricia began to notice something troubling. Several of the patients who David visited regularly seemed unusually distressed after his departures. An elderly man named Mr. Harrison, who had been in relatively good spirits despite his declining health, became withdrawn and anxious following David's weekend visits. Mrs. Chen, a woman with mild dementia who was typically pleasant and calm, would become agitated and tearful on Sunday evenings after David had spent time with her. Patricia mentioned her observations to other staff members, but most dismissed her concerns as coincidental or attributed the behavior changes to the natural progression of the patient's conditions. The situation reached a critical point when a family member arrived unexpectedly to visit her father on a Saturday afternoon. The daughter, whose name was Jennifer, had driven 3 hours from out of state and arrived outside of normal visiting hours. She went directly to her father's room and heard voices inside. When she opened the door, she found David sitting beside her father's bed. Her father, Mr. Bowman, was crying quietly. and David was speaking to him in a tone that Jennifer immediately recognized as cruel, despite the soft volume. She stood frozen in the doorway, as David told Mr. Bowman that his children only visited out of obligation and were actually relieved that he was dying because he had been a burden on them for years. Jennifer's shock quickly turned to rage. She demanded to know who David was and what he thought he was doing, speaking to her father that way. David stood up calmly, his expression neutral, and explained that he was a hospital volunteer having a difficult but necessary conversation with Mr. Bowman about acceptance and letting go. He spoke in a professional tone, claiming that therapeutic conversations sometimes involved confronting hard truths. Jennifer ordered David out of the room and immediately went to the nursing station to report what she had witnessed. David followed her and calmly reiterated his explanation to the staff, maintaining that Jennifer had misunderstood a therapeutic discussion. The nursing supervisor on duty took the complaint seriously and immediately notified the volunteer coordinator and hospital administration. An investigation was launched that same day. Jennifer provided a detailed written statement about what she had heard David saying to her father, and hospital security was instructed to review footage from cameras positioned in the hallways. While the cameras did not capture audio or show the interior of patient rooms, they did record David's movements throughout the hospital during his volunteer shifts. Security staff spent days reviewing footage and began to notice a disturbing pattern. David would enter patients' rooms and remain inside for extended periods, sometimes over an hour, with the door fully closed. This was unusual because volunteers were generally instructed to keep doors at least partially open, unless specifically requested otherwise by the patient. The footage also showed that David specifically targeted rooms of patients who were listed as having no recent visitors or whose families lived far away. He avoided rooms where family members were present or frequently visited. The hospital administration made the decision to install a hidden audio recording device in one of the rooms where David frequently visited. The patient was a woman named Mrs. Garcia, who had advanced dementia and whose family lived in another state. She had been in the hospital for 3 weeks and had received no visitors during that time. The recording captured during David's next visit was deeply disturbing and confirmed the worst fears of the investigative team. David entered Mrs. Garcia's room with his usual friendly greeting, asking how she was, feeling, and whether she needed anything. Once he had confirmed that she was alone and unlikely to be interrupted, his entire demeanor changed. David's voice became cold and clinical as he began speaking to Mrs. Garcia about her family. He told her in explicit detail that her children had not visited because they did not care about her and were waiting for her to die so they could inherit her property. He described how relieved they would be when she was gone, no longer a financial and emotional burden on their lives. Mrs. Garcia, whose dementia made her confused and vulnerable, became visibly distressed and began crying. David showed no reaction to her tears. He continued speaking in that same detached tone, describing the process of dying and telling her that she would die alone in this hospital room, with no one who loved her present. The recording was approximately 40 minutes long, and throughout its duration, David maintained the same emotionless delivery. He was not angry or cruel in the traditional sense. There was no passion or malice in his voice. He spoke as if he were narrating a documentary or conducting an experiment, observing Mrs. Garcia's reactions with clinical detachment. At one point, he took notes in a small journal, writing observations about how she responded to different statements. Near the end of the recording, a nurse knocked and entered to check Mrs. Garcia's vitals. David's demeanor changed instantly. His voice became warm and concerned as he comforted Mrs. Garcia and told the nurse that she had been having a difficult afternoon and feeling sad about missing her family. When confronted with the recording, David showed no shame or defensiveness. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the concern and anger directed at him. He explained that he found human responses to existential fear fascinating and that elderly patients near death provided unique opportunities to study how people coped with mortality when stripped of comforting illusions. He described his interactions as a form of psychological research, though he had no formal training in psychology beyond undergraduate coursework. David spoke about the patients as if they were subjects in an experiment rather than vulnerable human beings in his care. He expressed frustration that people were reacting emotionally instead of recognizing the scientific value of his observations. Hospital administrators were horrified by David's complete lack of empathy and his inability to recognize the cruelty of his actions. They immediately terminated his volunteer position and contacted law enforcement. However, the legal situation was complicated. While David's behavior was deeply unethical and psychologically harmful, most of his actions did not clearly violate criminal statutes. He had not physically harmed anyone or stolen property. The psychological abuse of elderly patients was difficult to prosecute, particularly when many of the victims had dementia or had since passed away and could not testify. The investigation expanded to include the facilities where David claimed to have volunteered previously. Administrators discovered that David had been asked to leave 2 other organizations under vague circumstances that were documented as not a good fit, rather than explicit misconduct. Neither organization had reported specific incidents, and David had not been formally accused of wrongdoing that would appear on a background check. He had carefully maintained his activities just within the boundaries of what was legally actionable, while inflicting significant psychological harm on vulnerable people. Psychiatric evaluation conducted as part of the investigation revealed that David exhibited classic psychopathic traits, including lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulative behavior, and a view of other people as objects to be studied rather than individuals with intrinsic worth. The evaluator noted that David showed no remorse for the distress he had caused, and genuinely did not understand why his behavior was considered problematic. He viewed himself as a curious observer, conducting valuable research, rather than as someone who had systematically terrorized dying patients during their most vulnerable moments. The hospital implemented new protocols requiring that all volunteers be supervised when interacting with vulnerable patients. But the damage David had caused could not be undone. Several families whose elderly relatives had been under his care came forward after learning about the investigation. They described how their loved ones had become inexplicably fearful and distressed during hospital stays, expressing paranoid thoughts about being abandoned or unloved. These families had attributed the behavior to dementia or medication side effects, never suspecting that a trusted volunteer had been systematically undermining their loved one's emotional stability in their final days. David moved to another state shortly after the investigation concluded. The hospital could not legally prevent him from volunteering elsewhere because he had not been criminally charged. They added him to internal databases and notified other hospitals in the region, but there was no central registry to prevent him from simply applying at organizations that did not check beyond basic criminal background checks. Staff members who had worked alongside David for 2 years felt betrayed and guilty that they had not recognized the signs of his true nature sooner. The psychological trauma he inflicted on patients who were already facing death and decline remained impossible to fully measure or address. Evelyn was a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in environmental science at a large public university. The program was demanding and required long hours in the laboratory conducting research on soil contamination and remediation strategies. Her modest stipend barely covered tuition and basic living expenses, which meant she needed to find affordable housing near campus. After weeks of searching through university housing boards and online listings, she found what seemed like an ideal situation. A doctoral student in psychology named Marcus was looking for a roommate to share a two-bedroom apartment located within walking distance of the main academic buildings. The rent was reasonable, utilities were included, and Marcus seemed professional and respectful during their initial meeting at a coffee shop near campus. Marcus was in his late 20s, tall and thin with dark-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual appearance. He explained that he was working on his dissertation and spent most of his time either in the psychology department or in his room conducting research and writing. He assured Evelyn that he was quiet and kept to himself, which aligned perfectly with what she was looking for in a living situation. They discussed basic ground rules about shared spaces, cleaning schedules, and quiet hours. Marcus seemed organized and reasonable, showing Evelyn a chart he had created for tracking household chores and expenses. Everything about the arrangement seemed ideal for two busy graduate students who needed affordable housing and minimal social obligations. Evelyn moved into the apartment in late August, just before the fall semester began. Her bedroom was small but adequate, with a window that overlooked a parking lot and enough space for her bed, desk, and a bookshelf. Marcus helped her carry boxes up the stairs and was polite and helpful during the move-in process. The first few weeks passed without incident. They maintained a cordial but distant relationship, occasionally crossing paths in the kitchen or living room, but mostly staying in their separate spaces. Marcus seemed to spend most of his waking hours either away at the university or closed in his room working on his computer. Evelyn appreciated the quiet environment, which allowed her to focus on her coursework and research responsibilities. The first sign that something was wrong came in mid-September, when Evelyn began experiencing unusual sleep disturbances. She would go to bed exhausted after long days in the laboratory, but would wake up feeling even more tired than when she had gone to sleep. Her dreams were vivid and unsettling, filled with anxiety and confusion that lingered into her waking hours. She attributed this to stress from her demanding academic program and increased her caffeine intake to compensate for the persistent fatigue. Around the same time, she began noticing that Marcus watched her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. When they were in shared spaces, she would catch him staring at her with an expression that seemed analytical rather than friendly. If she made casual conversation about her day or her research, he would pull out a small notebook and write notes while maintaining eye contact. When Evelyn asked Marcus about the constant note-taking, he explained that as a psychology doctoral student, he was trained to observe human behavior and communication patterns. He claimed that taking notes was simply a habit from his research work, and that he found interpersonal dynamics fascinating from an academic perspective. His explanation seemed plausible enough, and Evelyn did not want to seem paranoid or accusatory. So she accepted it despite her lingering discomfort. However, the behavior continued and seemed to intensify. Marcus began asking her detailed questions about her sleep quality, her stress levels, and her emotional state. The questions felt invasive, but were framed in language that made them sound like casual concern rather than intrusive interrogation. Other strange incidents began to accumulate. Small personal items would go missing from Evelyn's room, things like a hairbrush, a favorite t-shirt she wore to sleep, and a journal where she kept research notes and personal reflections. She would find these items days later in different locations, never where she had left them. The thermostat in the apartment seemed to fluctuate wildly, making her room uncomfortably hot or cold at seemingly random times. She would adjust it, only to find it changed again within hours. Objects in her room were occasionally moved slightly, positioned in ways that felt wrong, but that she could not definitively prove had been altered. The cumulative effect of these incidents made her feel disoriented and anxious, though she could not point to any single event that was clearly threatening or malicious. The truth came to light when Evelyn decided to do a thorough cleaning of her room in October. She was dusting the smoke detector mounted on her ceiling when she noticed that it seemed newer and slightly different from the one she remembered seeing when she first moved in. Upon closer inspection, she realized it was not a smoke detector at all, but a sophisticated hidden camera disguised to look like one. The discovery sent waves of horror and violation through her body. She immediately began searching the rest of her room and found a second camera hidden inside what appeared to be an ordinary air freshener plugged into an outlet near her bed. Someone had been watching her in her most private space, recording her as she slept and changed clothes. Evelyn felt sick as the implications became clear. She checked her laptop and discovered spyware had been installed that logged her keystrokes and browsing history. Someone had access to all her passwords, emails, and personal information. The only person with access to her room was Marcus. She confronted him immediately, her hands shaking with rage and fear as she held the fake smoke detector. Marcus did not deny anything. Instead, he looked at her with that same analytical expression and calmly confirmed that yes, he had installed the cameras and the spyware. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a routine aspect of his day rather than a serious violation of her privacy and autonomy. Marcus explained that Evelyn was part of his dissertation research on behavioral conditioning and stress response in controlled environments. He had been systematically manipulating various aspects of her environment to study how she responded to different stressors. The temperature fluctuations, the moved objects, the missing items, the disturbed sleep. All of it had been intentional manipulation designed to create stress and disorientation. He had been drugging her evening tea with mild sedatives to affect her sleep quality, and then measuring her cognitive performance and emotional state the following day. He showed Evelyn thick binders filled with detailed documentation of his experiment, including charts tracking her behavior, transcripts of their conversations, and analysis of how different interventions affected her measurable responses. What horrified Evelyn most was not just the violation itself, but Marcus's complete inability to understand that what he had done was wrong. He spoke about the research with genuine enthusiasm, describing it as groundbreaking work that would revolutionize understanding of environmental stressors on human psychology. He seemed genuinely confused and irritated by her anger, repeatedly explaining that the data he had collected was invaluable and that she should feel honored to have contributed to such important research. When Evelyn threatened to call the police, Marcus calmly pointed out that she had signed a general consent form for psychology research participation as part of her student enrollment agreement. He had intentionally misled her about that document, using it as potential legal cover for his unauthorized experimentation. Evelyn called the police immediately, and they arrived within 20 minutes of her call. The officers were disturbed by what they found in Marcus's room. In addition to the monitoring equipment and detailed research documentation about Evelyn, they discovered similar files on 3 previous roommates. Marcus had been conducting these unauthorized experiments for years, systematically manipulating the environments and behaviors of vulnerable people who trusted him as a roommate. Each file contained thousands of photographs, hours of video footage, detailed behavioral analysis, and notes about which manipulation techniques produced the most significant stress responses. The subjects of these experiments had all experienced psychological distress during their time living with Marcus, but none had discovered the true cause until now. University investigators and police discovered that Marcus had fabricated the ethical approval documents he claimed to have for his research. His dissertation advisor had been completely unaware of these experiments and was horrified to learn what Marcus had been doing. The ethical violations were staggering in their scope and severity. Marcus had systematically deceived and harmed multiple people, all while convincing himself that he was conducting legitimate scientific research. Psychiatric evaluation revealed that Marcus exhibited classic psychopathic traits, including lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulative behavior, grandiose sense of self-worth, and a view of other people as objects to be used for his purposes rather than individuals with rights and autonomy. Marcus was expelled from the university and charged with multiple crimes, including stalking, illegal surveillance, and unlawful imprisonment through deception. However, his sentences were relatively light, amounting to less than 2 years in jail and probation. Evelyn struggled to understand how someone could commit such extensive violations and receive such minimal consequences. The legal system seemed ill-equipped to address the psychological nature of his crimes. There were no physical injuries, no financial theft in the traditional sense, just profound psychological violation that would take years for his victims to process and overcome. Evelyn required extensive therapy to recover from the trauma of learning she had been watched, manipulated, and studied like a laboratory animal for months. She developed severe anxiety and trust issues that affected her ability to complete her graduate program. She had to take a leave of absence to focus on her mental health. The other victims of Marcus's experiments came forward during the investigation, and they shared similar stories of unexplained psychological distress, sleep disturbances, and feelings of being watched that they had attributed to stress or mental illness. None had suspected their roommate was systematically manipulating their environments and documenting their suffering for a fraudulent research project. The case prompted the university to strengthen oversight of student research involving human subjects and to implement better screening processes for psychology graduate students. However, the damage Marcus caused to multiple people over several years could not be undone. Evelyn learned that Marcus's previous roommates had also struggled with anxiety, paranoia, and other psychological issues during and after living with him. They had all thought they were experiencing normal stress responses to graduate school, never knowing they were being deliberately traumatized by someone they trusted. The knowledge that such profound violation could occur in what should have been a safe living space fundamentally changed how all the victims viewed trust and safety. Marcus showed no remorse throughout his trial and sentencing, maintaining that his research was valuable and that people simply did not understand the importance of his work. Joseph was driving through a remote stretch of highway in the early hours of the morning when his car began making a worrying, grinding noise. He had been traveling for work, returning home from a client meeting in a neighboring state, and had chosen to drive through the night to avoid paying for a hotel. The road he was on cut through rural farmland and dense woods, with long stretches between towns and minimal traffic at that hour. When the grinding noise escalated to a loud knocking sound, and the car began to lose power, Joseph guided it onto the shoulder and watched with sinking dread as the engine died completely. He tried restarting it several times, but the car refused to turn over. He was stranded on a dark road with no visible lights from houses or businesses in any direction. Joseph pulled out his cell phone and discovered he had no signal. The remote location meant he was beyond the reach of cell towers, leaving him completely cut off from any way to call for help. He got out of the car and looked up and down the empty highway, seeing nothing but darkness punctuated by occasional reflective road signs. The night air was cold, and he could see his breath forming clouds in the beam of his phone's flashlight. He was dressed in business casual clothing that was inadequate for spending hours outside in the October chill. Joseph estimated he was at least 15 miles from the nearest town he had passed through, too far to walk in the dark on an unfamiliar road. For over an hour, Joseph sat in his disabled car watching for any sign of approaching headlights. A few vehicles passed, but none stopped despite his attempts to flag them down. He was beginning to seriously worry about his situation when he finally saw headlights approaching from behind. A pickup truck slowed as it neared his car and pulled onto the shoulder behind him. Joseph felt a wave of relief as he got out to meet his potential rescuer. A man stepped out of the truck, appearing to be in his late 30s, with a friendly smile and an offer to help. He introduced himself as Cole and asked what the problem was. Joseph explained about the engine failure and his lack of cell phone signal. Cole walked around the car, looked under the hood, and said he knew a bit about engines, but could not fix it here on the roadside. Cole offered to drive Joseph to the nearest town where there was a gas station with a phone and a tow truck service. Joseph gratefully accepted the offer and retrieved his wallet and phone from the car before climbing into the passenger seat of Cole's truck. The interior smelled faintly of chemicals, something sharp and unpleasant that Joseph could not quite identify. He noticed the truck bed was covered with a tarp that appeared to be concealing something, but he could not see what in the darkness. Cole seemed friendly enough as they drove, asking Joseph about where he was coming from and where he lived. The conversation felt normal at first. Just two strangers making small talk during an unexpected late-night encounter. After about 10 minutes of driving, Joseph began to notice that Cole seemed to be taking turns that led away from the direction of town rather than toward it. When he mentioned this observation, Cole gave vague explanations about shortcuts and avoiding construction zones. His tone remained friendly, but his answers did not quite make sense. Joseph felt the first stirrings of unease in his stomach. He looked more carefully at his surroundings and realized they were driving deeper into rural areas with fewer and fewer signs of civilization. The chemical smell in the truck seemed stronger now, and Joseph noticed dark stains on the floor mat near his feet that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Cole began asking more specific and personal questions. He wanted to know if anyone was expecting Joseph tonight, if anyone knew his exact route, if he had family waiting for him. The questions felt wrong, too pointed and deliberate. Joseph gave evasive answers, claiming people were expecting him soon and would be worried if he did not arrive. Cole's friendly demeanor began to slip. His smile became fixed and unnatural, and his eyes took on a calculating quality that made Joseph's skin crawl with fear. They passed the turn that would have led into town, and when Joseph protested, Cole ignored him completely. The pretense dropped entirely when Cole spoke again. His voice had changed, becoming flat and emotionless in a way that was more frightening than anger would have been. He told Joseph that accepting help from strangers was a dangerous thing to do. He described in disturbing detail what he had planned for Joseph, speaking in the same tone someone might use to discuss their grocery shopping list. Cole mentioned previous travelers he had picked up on this same stretch of road, providing specific details about what had happened to them that left no doubt he was telling the truth. He spoke about their fear and their pleas with what sounded like clinical interest rather than sadistic pleasure. It was as if he were describing laboratory experiments rather than the torture and murder of human beings. Joseph's mind raced as terror flooded through his body. He was trapped in a moving vehicle with someone who had just calmly explained plans to kill him. Cole was not driving fast, maintaining a steady, moderate speed that suggested he was confident and in no hurry. They were on a narrow rural road with dense woods on both sides. Joseph knew his only chance was to escape from the truck, regardless of the risk of injury. He waited for a moment when Cole had to slow down for a sharp curve in the road. As the truck decelerated, Joseph grabbed the door handle and threw himself out of the moving vehicle. He hit the pavement hard and rolled several times before coming to rest on the gravel shoulder. Pain exploded through his body from multiple points of impact, but adrenaline kept him moving, scrambled to his feet, and ran directly into the woods, hearing the screech of brakes behind him as Cole stopped the truck. Joseph crashed through undergrowth and low branches, running blindly in the darkness with no sense of direction except away from the road. He could hear Cole calling after him in that same emotionless voice. telling him to come back to the truck as if Joseph were a misbehaving child rather than someone fleeing for his life. Joseph ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out beneath him. He found a dense thicket of bushes and crawled into the center of it, trying to control his ragged breathing and remain completely silent. Through the darkness, he could see the beam of a flashlight sweeping through the trees. Cole was searching for him with methodical efficiency, moving through the woods in a grid pattern and stopping periodically to listen for sounds of movement. The search went on for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 or 40 minutes. Cole's voice would occasionally drift through the trees, calling out observations about how far Joseph could not have gotten and how the woods would be difficult to navigate in the dark. Joseph remained frozen in his hiding place, ignoring the cold and the pain from his injuries. He watched the flashlight beam sweep past his position multiple times, coming close enough that he was certain Cole would see him. Each time the beam moved on without stopping, Joseph held his breath and prayed for the search to end. Eventually, as the sky began to show the first hints of pre-dawn light, the flashlight beam disappeared, and Joseph heard the distant sound of a truck engine starting. He waited another hour before daring to move, terrified that Cole might be waiting silently nearby. When full daylight arrived, Joseph emerged from his hiding place and tried to orient himself. He was scratched, bruised, and limping from his jump from the truck, but alive. He walked through the woods until he found a different road than the one where Cole had been driving. He followed that road for several miles until he reached a small highway with occasional traffic. A delivery truck driver stopped when Joseph flagged him down, and the driver called police after hearing a brief version of what had happened. The police investigation that followed revealed a disturbing pattern. The area where Cole had been driving Joseph was known to law enforcement as a location where several people had gone missing over the past 5 years. Investigators found multiple illegal dump sites in the woods near where Cole had been taking Joseph. While no bodies were recovered, evidence at these sites strongly suggested foul play. The sites contained personal belongings, clothing, and biological evidence that indicated violence had occurred there. Cole's truck was identified through Joseph's description, but the vehicle had been stolen and the plates were fake. The man calling himself Cole had abandoned the truck and disappeared completely. Further investigation revealed that a similar pattern had occurred in 2 other regions over the past decade. Someone matching Cole's general description would appear after travelers had car trouble on remote roads, offer assistance, and then the travelers would vanish. Joseph was the first person to escape and report the experience in detail. Detectives believed that the man was responsible for numerous disappearances across multiple states, always targeting people who were stranded and vulnerable on isolated roads. The complete lack of emotion in his voice when describing his plans suggested severe psychopathic traits, including absence of empathy, predatory behavior, and treating murder as routine activity. Despite extensive searches and investigations, the man was never caught. The stolen truck yielded no useful forensic evidence beyond confirmation that multiple people had been in the vehicle at different times, some of whom matched missing persons' descriptions. Cole, if that was even his real name, had simply vanished. Authorities suspected he moved to a different region and continued his pattern of predatory behavior. Joseph provided detailed descriptions to forensic artists and participated in multiple interviews with law enforcement. But without a real name or clear trail to follow, the investigation eventually went cold. Joseph struggles with the psychological aftermath of his experience. He was the first person to survive an encounter with this predator and provide testimony. But that knowledge brings guilt rather than comfort. He thinks about the people Cole mentioned during that drive, the previous victims whose suffering Cole described with such detached clinical interest. Joseph wonders how many people were killed by someone who viewed murder not as a crime of passion or even malice, but as something routine and unremarkable. The complete absence of emotion in Cole's voice haunts Joseph more than threats or anger would have. It suggested someone for whom killing was simply a task to be completed, no different than any other daily activity. The case remains open, and Joseph receives occasional updates from investigators when new information emerges. So far, there have been no breaks in identifying or locating the man. Joseph lives with hypervigilance about his surroundings and an inability to trust helpful strangers. The knowledge that someone so dangerous remains free and likely continues to prey on stranded travelers creates a persistent anxiety that therapy has only partially addressed. Sometimes Joseph wonders if he will ever feel truly safe again, knowing that people like Cole exist and move through society completely undetected until the moment they reveal their true nature. Scarlett had been going through the most difficult period of her adult life when she decided to seek professional help. Her marriage of 8 years had ended in a bitter divorce that left her emotionally devastated and financially strained. The dissolution had been contentious, involving accusations and legal battles that drained both her bank account and her sense of self-worth. Friends had encouraged her to talk to someone, to process the trauma and rebuild her confidence. After researching therapists in her area who specialized in divorce recovery and trauma counseling, Scarlett found Dr. Morris, whose credentials were impressive and whose online reviews were overwhelmingly positive. Former clients described him as insightful, compassionate, and genuinely invested in their healing journeys. The first session with Dr. Morris took place in his comfortable office located in a professional building downtown. The space was decorated with soothing colors and comfortable furniture designed to put clients at ease. Dr. Morris was in his early 50s, with graying hair and a calm demeanor that immediately made Scarlett feel safe sharing her story. He listened attentively as she described the breakdown of her marriage, the feelings of failure and betrayal that haunted her, and the difficulty she was having moving forward with her life. Dr. Morris asked thoughtful questions and offered observations that seemed perceptive and helpful. By the end of the first session, Scarlett felt hopeful that therapy would help her heal and regain control of her life. Over the following weeks, Scarlett attended weekly sessions with Dr. Morris. She opened up about her deepest insecurities, her childhood wounds that had contributed to relationship patterns, her fears about being alone, and her anxiety about financial stability. Dr. Morris encouraged this vulnerability, explaining that confronting painful truths was necessary for genuine healing. Scarlett trusted him completely and shared details about her life that she had never told anyone. She discussed her strained relationship with her family, her difficulties forming close friendships, and her tendency toward anxiety and self-doubt. Dr. Morris took detailed notes during every session and frequently referenced previous conversations, which made Scarlett feel heard and understood. The troubling pattern began subtly in the third month of therapy. Scarlett mentioned during a session that she was anxious about her financial situation and worried about making ends meet on her single income. Within days of that session, she received an unexpected bill from her car insurance company for an administrative error that required immediate payment. A few days later, her landlord informed her that there would be a rent increase starting the following month. Then her employer announced unexpected budget cuts that would reduce her work hours. Each incident on its own could be coincidental, but the timing seemed strange. Scarlett mentioned these stressors during her next therapy session, and Dr. Morris helped her process the anxiety they created. This pattern continued and intensified over the following months. Scarlett would discuss a specific fear or insecurity during therapy, and within days, she would face situations that seemed designed to trigger that exact vulnerability. When she talked about her fear of abandonment, a close friend suddenly stopped returning her calls after what appeared to be a misunderstanding. When she mentioned her insecurity about her appearance, she overheard cruel comments from strangers that seemed oddly targeted at her specific insecurities. When she discussed trust issues, she discovered that a colleague had been sharing confidential information about her at work. Each crisis drove Scarlett back to therapy, feeling more dependent on Dr. Morris for support and guidance. Scarlett began to feel that her life was spiraling out of control despite the therapy that was supposed to be helping her. She was seeing Dr. Morris twice per week now, and he suggested that she might benefit from more intensive treatment given the multiple stressors she was experiencing. The sessions were expensive, and the increased frequency was straining her already tight budget. But Dr. Morris assured her that this investment in her mental health was crucial. He explained that she was going through a particularly difficult phase of healing that required more support. And Scarlett believed him because she trusted his professional judgment completely. The truth began to emerge when Scarlett ran into an old friend who worked in social media marketing. During casual conversation, Scarlett mentioned some of the strange coincidences and difficulties she had been experiencing. Her friend asked if Scarlett had noticed any unusual activity on her social media accounts, or if anyone had been asking questions about her. This question struck Scarlett as odd, and she pressed for more information. Her friend explained that she had seen what appeared to be fake profiles interacting with Scarlett's friends and family members, asking questions and stirring up misunderstandings. The profile names were slightly different variations of real people's names, subtle enough that most people would not notice unless they looked carefully. This revelation prompted Scarlett to investigate further. She discovered that several of the recent crises in her life had originated from sources that did not quite make sense when examined closely. The insurance bill had come from a number that was not actually her insurance company. The rent increase notice had formatting inconsistencies with previous official communications from her landlord. The rumor-spreading colleague claimed to have never made the statements attributed to her and suspected someone had been impersonating her in emails. As Scarlett pieced together these inconsistencies, a horrifying picture began to form. Someone had been systematically manipulating her life, creating crises and conflicts designed to keep her in a state of emotional turmoil. The possibility that Dr. Morris could be involved seemed unthinkable at first. He was a licensed professional bound by ethical codes and dedicated to helping people. However, Scarlett could not ignore that he was the only person who knew about all of her specific fears and vulnerabilities. She had shared details with him that she had not told anyone else, and those exact details seemed to be weaponized against her in the manufactured crises. Scarlett made the difficult decision to install monitoring software on her own devices and to carefully document everything that happened following her therapy sessions. The evidence that accumulated over the next few weeks was damning. Someone had accessed Scarlett's email and social media accounts from IP addresses that traced back to locations near Dr. Morris's office and home. Phone records showed calls from numbers associated with fake bills and communications that originated from burner phones purchased near Dr. Morris's office. Most conclusively, Scarlett set up a hidden camera in her home and caught footage of someone entering her apartment while she was at work. The person was not clearly visible, but they matched Dr. Morris's general build and had a key that should not have existed. They left behind a manipulated bill that was designed to create financial stress. When Scarlett confronted Dr. Morris with this evidence during what would be their final session, his response was unlike anything she could have anticipated. He did not deny the accusations or show shock at being discovered. Instead, he calmly admitted to everything and seemed genuinely confused about why Scarlett was upset. Dr. Morris explained that he had been conducting what he called immersion therapy, a technique he had developed that involved exposing patients to their fears in real-world situations to help them overcome those fears more effectively than traditional talk therapy could achieve. He showed Scarlett detailed files documenting his interventions in her life, complete with observations about her responses and analysis of her coping mechanisms. Dr. Morris spoke about his methods with pride rather than shame. He explained that creating controlled crises allowed him to observe how patients handled stress in authentic situations rather than hypothetical scenarios discussed in an office. He genuinely believed that his approach was innovative and therapeutically valuable. When Scarlett pointed out that she had been suffering tremendously and that he had violated her privacy, autonomy, and trust in horrifying ways, Dr. Morris seemed irritated rather than remorseful. He insisted that traditional therapy was ineffective and that his methods produced better results, even if patients did not appreciate them during the process. He viewed Scarlett's anger as an unfortunate but temporary side effect of treatment, rather than a justified response to severe ethical violations. Scarlett immediately reported Dr. Morris to the state licensing board and to law enforcement. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of similar behavior spanning over a decade. Dr. Morris had been systematically manipulating the lives of numerous patients, orchestrating crises and conflicts while convincing them they needed more intensive and expensive therapy to cope with the situations he himself had created. Other patients came forward with stories that mirrored Scarlett's experience. They described lives that fell apart while in therapy with Dr. Morris, relationships that deteriorated, jobs that were lost, and financial problems that mounted, all while Dr. Morris encouraged them to increase the frequency of sessions and depend more heavily on his guidance. Investigators discovered extensive documentation in Dr. Morris's office and home computer systems. He had kept detailed records of his interventions in patients' lives, written in clinical language that treated people as experimental subjects rather than vulnerable individuals seeking help. He had spent thousands of dollars on burner phones, fake identities, and tools for accessing patients' private information. He had contacted patients' family members, friends, employers, and landlords, while posing as researchers, concerned citizens, or other false identities, manipulating those relationships to create conflict and stress. The scope of his activities was staggering in both its extent and its callousness. What made Dr. Morris's actions particularly disturbing was his complete inability to recognize that he had done anything wrong. Throughout the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings, he maintained that his approach was therapeutic and that patients would eventually understand the value of his methods. He showed no empathy for the psychological damage he had caused or the lives he had disrupted. Psychiatric evaluation revealed that Dr. Morris exhibited severe personality disorders, including narcissistic traits, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and an inability to recognize ethical boundaries. He had convinced himself that his innovation in therapy justified any means, and he viewed patients not as people deserving of care, but as subjects in experiments designed to validate his theories. Dr. Morris lost his license to practice and was charged with multiple crimes, including fraud, stalking, harassment, and computer crimes related to unauthorized access of personal information. However, his sentences were relatively light given the extensive harm he had caused. The legal system struggled to adequately address crimes that were primarily psychological rather than physical. Many of his actions existed in gray areas of the law, and proving specific damages was challenging when much of the harm was emotional and psychological rather than financial or physical. Scarlett required years of legitimate therapy to recover from the trauma of having her most vulnerable confessions weaponized against her by someone she trusted completely. she learned that several of Dr. Morris's former patients had attempted self-harm or experienced complete psychological breakdowns as a result of the orchestrated crises he created. Some had lost marriages, jobs, and custody of children due to the conflicts and problems he manufactured in their lives. The violation ran deep because these were people who had sought help during their most vulnerable moments, only to be systematically exploited and harmed by the professional they trusted to heal them. The case raised troubling questions about how Dr. Morris had maintained his practice for over a decade despite causing obvious harm to numerous patients. The answer lay partly in the isolated nature of therapy relationships and the tendency of suffering patients to blame themselves rather than their therapist when their lives deteriorated. Dr. Morris had also been skilled at documenting therapy in ways that made his interventions seem like standard treatment rather than manipulation. Patients who complained were dismissed as resistant to treatment or unwilling to do the difficult work of healing. Scarlett still struggles with trust and questions whether any aspect of her recovery during that time was genuine or simply another layer of Dr. Morris's manipulation. She advocates now for stronger oversight of mental health professionals and better mechanisms for patients to report unethical behavior without fear of being dismissed as mentally unstable. The knowledge that someone so fundamentally broken was given power over vulnerable people haunts her in ways that are difficult to articulate. Dr. Morris's conviction that he had done nothing wrong and that his methods were misunderstood makes his crimes even more disturbing, because it suggests he would continue the same behavior if given any opportunity. Owen worked as a software developer at a mid-sized technology company located in a suburban office park. The company employed approximately 200 people across various departments, including development, sales, marketing, and customer support. The work environment was casual and collaborative, with an open office layout designed to encourage communication between team members. Owen had been with the company for 3 years and generally enjoyed his job despite the occasional stressful deadline or difficult client project. He kept to himself for the most part, preferring to focus on his coding work rather than engage in extensive office socializing. But he maintained friendly professional relationships with his immediate co-workers. Victoria worked in the customer support department, which was located in the same open office area as the development team. Her cubicle was adjacent to Owen's, separated only by a low partition that allowed for easy conversation between workstations. Victoria had joined the company about 6 months after Owen and had always been pleasant and outgoing. She would often strike up conversations with Owen about work-related topics, occasionally asking for technical help with customer issues, or simply chatting about weekend plans and current events. Owen appreciated having a friendly face nearby and enjoyed their casual interactions, though he never thought of their relationship as anything beyond cordial co-workers. Over time, Victoria's interest in Owen's life seemed to intensify in ways that initially felt flattering, but gradually became uncomfortable. She began asking increasingly personal questions about his daily routine, his living situation, his relationship status, and his family background. When Owen mentioned during one conversation that he lived alone in an apartment across town, Victoria's questions became more specific. She wanted to know exactly where he lived, what his commute was like, whether he felt safe in that neighborhood, and what he did in his free time. Owen answered these questions without much thought at first, assuming Victoria was simply making friendly conversation and showing genuine interest in getting to know her coworker better. The pattern of coincidental encounters began about 2 months into their friendship. Owen mentioned during a lunch break that he was a member of a particular gym near his apartment. The following week, Victoria announced that she had just joined the same gym and asked Owen about his workout schedule so they could potentially exercise together. Owen found this slightly odd, since the gym was not particularly close to where Victoria lived. based on what she had mentioned about her commute. But he did not think much of it. A few weeks later, Owen casually mentioned his favorite coffee shop where he often worked on weekends. Within days, Victoria began appearing at that same coffee shop on weekend mornings, always acting surprised to see Owen there and asking to join him at his table. These coincidences accumulated over the following months. Owen would mention a restaurant he liked, and Victoria would show up there. He would talk about planning to see a particular movie, and Victoria would be at the same showing. He would mention shopping at a specific grocery store, and Victoria would appear in the same aisles. Each time, Victoria would express surprise at the coincidence and suggest it must be fate or evidence that they had similar tastes and lifestyles. Owen began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with these encounters, but did not want to seem paranoid or accusatory. He convinced himself that perhaps they did simply have overlapping routines and preferences, though the frequency of these meetings seemed statistically improbable. The situation escalated when Owen's neighbor mentioned seeing a woman matching Victoria's description in the apartment building hallway on multiple occasions. The neighbor had assumed she was visiting someone in the building, but had never seen her actually enter any apartment. This information disturbed Owen deeply, as it suggested Victoria had been coming to his building for reasons she had never disclosed to him. Around the same time, Owen received a friend request on social media from an account using the name of his younger sister. The profile picture was blurry, and the account had no posting history, which seemed suspicious. Owen called his sister to verify, and she confirmed she had never created a new social media account. Someone had created a fake profile using her name and photograph. Owen began investigating and discovered that this fake account had been interacting with multiple members of his family and friend group, gathering information about his life through casual conversations and questions. The account had befriended his parents, his college roommate, and several cousins, always asking questions that eventually circled back to details about Owen's schedule, preferences, and personal history. Owen felt violated and frightened by this systematic gathering of information about his life. The only person who had shown this level of intense interest in him was Victoria, and the timing of the fake account's creation coincided with when Victoria had started working at the company. Owen reported Victoria to Human Resources, providing documentation of the fake social media account and explaining his concerns about her following him to various locations and showing up at his apartment building. The Human Resources Department took the complaint seriously and launched an investigation. They discovered that Victoria had been using her access to company systems to view Owen's personnel file multiple times, including information she had no legitimate business reason to access, such as his home address, emergency contact information, and salary details. ET Forensics revealed that she had been logging into systems beyond her authorized access level, exploiting a security vulnerability to gather information about Owen that should have been confidential. When confronted by Human Resources about these activities, Victoria's initial response was to claim that Owen had been encouraging her attention and that they had been developing a romantic relationship. She portrayed herself as a woman who had been led on by a co-worker who was now trying to distance himself unfairly. However, when presented with concrete evidence of the unauthorized system access and the fake social media account, her story began to fall apart. IT investigators had traced the fake account back to IP addresses associated with Victoria's home and mobile devices. They had also found messages on her work computer where she discussed gathering information about Owen with someone outside the company. Victoria's demeanor changed dramatically when she realized the evidence against her was overwhelming. The friendly, warm persona she had always projected disappeared completely, replaced by cold hostility. She became angry rather than defensive, stating that Owen should be grateful for the attention and interest she had shown in him. She expressed resentment that he was rejecting her efforts to build a relationship, framing his complaints as ingratitude rather than legitimate concerns about stalking and privacy violation. Victoria showed no understanding that her behavior had been inappropriate, threatening, or illegal. Instead, she seemed to believe that her intense interest in Owen was flattering and that his negative reaction was a personal insult to her. The investigation expanded beyond just Victoria's interactions with Owen. Human Resources discovered that she had engaged in similar behavior at 2 previous jobs, both times fixating on male co-workers and gathering extensive personal information about them. In both previous situations, she had been asked to leave under confidential settlement agreements that prevented the companies from disclosing the specific reasons for her departure. Victoria had essentially been allowed to move from job to job, each time targeting new victims while her previous employers remained silent about her conduct due to legal agreements designed to avoid liability and public controversy. Company records revealed that Victoria had falsified portions of her employment application and resume. References she had provided were either fabricated or came from people who had agreed to give positive recommendations without disclosing the problematic circumstances of her previous departures. Background checks conducted during the hiring process had found no criminal record because Victoria had never been formally charged with stalking or harassment. Her previous employers had chosen to handle situations quietly through settlements rather than involve law enforcement, allowing her to maintain a clean legal record while continuing to engage in predatory behavior. Further investigation revealed disturbing details about the extent of Victoria's obsession with Owen. She had created detailed files on her personal computer documenting his daily routines, including times he arrived at and left work, vehicles he drove, clothing he wore, and people he interacted with. She had taken photographs of him without his knowledge or consent, some clearly taken from hidden vantage points in the office and others taken while following him in public spaces. She had compiled information about his family members, romantic history, and personal vulnerabilities that she could only have obtained through extensive research and deception. Most troubling was evidence that Victoria had been planning to escalate her behavior beyond information gathering and coincidental encounters. Investigators found draft messages on her computer where she had written scripts for confronting Owen about their supposed relationship, complete with accusations designed to make him feel guilty for not reciprocating her feelings. There were also indications that she had been researching ways to sabotage Owen's professional reputation if he continued to reject her attention, including plans to file false complaints about his conduct or spread rumors about inappropriate behavior. Victoria was terminated immediately, and a restraining order was filed requiring her to stay away from Owen, the workplace, and Owen's residence. However, Victoria violated the restraining order multiple times over the following weeks, appearing at locations where Owen was known to frequent and attempting to contact him through various means, including burner phone numbers and new social media accounts. Each violation resulted in police reports, but Victoria was ultimately arrested only after she attempted to enter Owen's apartment building and was caught on security camera footage trying to bypass the locked entrance. Psychiatric evaluation conducted as part of the criminal proceedings revealed that Victoria exhibited traits consistent with erotomania, a delusional disorder characterized by the belief that another person is in love with them despite clear evidence to the contrary. She also showed signs of obsessive fixation, inability to accept rejection, lack of empathy for her target's distress, and manipulative behavior designed to create and maintain access to her victims. The evaluator noted that Victoria had convinced herself that her feelings for Owen were reciprocated, and that any resistance from him was simply a misunderstanding or test of her devotion rather than genuine rejection. Owen struggled with the professional and personal fallout from Victoria's stalking. Despite being cleared of any wrongdoing, Several co-workers who had initially heard Victoria's version of events continued to view him with suspicion or discomfort. Rebuilding his professional reputation within the company required months of consistent behavior and transparency about what had actually occurred. Owen developed significant anxiety about forming any kind of friendly relationship with co-workers, never knowing whether casual friendliness might be misinterpreted as romantic interest or encouragement. The experience taught Owen that predators could exist in ordinary workplace environments, presenting themselves as friendly and normal, while systematically gathering information and planning escalating intrusions. What disturbed him most about Victoria was her complete conviction that she was the victim in the situation, that his refusal to accept her attention was a personal wrong committed against her rather than a reasonable response to threatening and violating behavior. She remained unable to recognize her conduct as stalking or harassment, viewing herself as someone who had been unfairly punished for caring too much about another person. Detective work revealed that Victoria had likely engaged in similar patterns of behavior throughout her adult life, targeting multiple men over the years with varying degrees of intensity. The men she had previously obsessed over had dealt with the situation by changing jobs, moving to different cities, or simply enduring the harassment until Victoria eventually moved on to a new target. Owen was the first person to formally report her behavior and pursue legal action, which brought some small measure of justice, but could not undo the months of violation and fear he had experienced. Victoria served minimal jail time and was released on probation with requirements for psychiatric treatment. However, Owen learned from his attorney that compliance with treatment recommendations could not be effectively enforced, and that Victoria's conviction that she had done nothing wrong made genuine rehabilitation unlikely. He lives with the knowledge that Victoria may continue to obsess over him, or may have already moved on to fixating on someone new. The restraining order provides some legal protection, but cannot prevent Victoria from monitoring his social media, gathering information about his life, or continuing to believe in the delusional relationship she constructed in her mind. Some violations are invisible and ongoing, existing in the mind of the perpetrator regardless of legal barriers or physical distance.